The 1960s were a turning point in fashion's history. Raising the hemline, miniskirts appeared, finally allowing for the knee to become exposed. Gone the days of the one-legged pin needle stance. Women's legs are now clearly visible, and there are actually two of them. If you're new here, this is a series about making a whole wardrobe from scratch, a wardrobe that is made to measure with all the basic essentials. My goal is to make something of quality that is meant to last, meant to be loved. So let's have a cozy sewing session and chat a bit about fashion and fashion history along the way. Today I'm going to make a skirt, a short one, because today it's going to be mostly about creating this very flattering, figure-fitting silhouette that's meant to trace the curves from hip to waist. I had actually made a skirt just like that and I loved it very much. This design, this very fitted, high-waisted miniskirt silhouette reminds me mostly of the skirts that were fashionable in the late 80s, very early 90s, that were sometimes part of a suit. It's going to have 2 darts in the front and 4 in the back, so it's also going to have a bit of that 50s flair meshed up with the length that was so revolutionary in the 60s. Don't be scared if you're new to drafting. As usual, there is a free PDF with detailed instructions so you'd be able to construct this pattern for your own measurements. You should obviously make a mock-up. However, I made skirts for several people using this basis and not once did I have to make any major adjustments. I'd say it's a very versatile garment regarding styling overall, and that's an extremely important aspect for building a wardrobe where everything has its purpose. Here your personal style, your comfort is obviously crucial. You're very welcome to adjust this pattern to your own preferences. In general though, it's a great training ground to learn about darts and several basic sewing procedures. I chose corduroy for this skirt, a fabric that I highly recommend. First of all, it's very durable, easy to work with, almost like denim. I'd argue it has a sort of casual aura about it because it's so often used like denim. It's so often used in heavy-duty wear. On the other hand though, the way its brilliance breaks down in light down to almost black, the way it drapes so stiffly, it reminds me of those very glamorous, rich, heavy velvets. And essentially they are related. It's a pile textile. Similar like velvet, velveteen, its facing is woven onto a base, the backing, and then it's cut or rather sheared to leave all of these little ends, little hairs loose that feel so incredibly smooth. And the particular thing about corduroy is that it's woven to leave all of these stripes, these ridges, that essentially reveal the backing. Those are called wales. There are several types of corduroy depending on the width of these wales. Mine is very fine. As you can see, it has a bit of elastan woven into it, which makes it stretchy to one side. That was not necessarily what I was looking for, but it was on sale. It will make the skirt a bit more comfortable. However, this pattern absolutely works for non-stretchy materials. Corduroy is always in and out of style. It was especially popular in the 60s and 70s. It is also an integral part of the stereotypical academia style. It works almost like an intermediary because unlike denim, it is able to lend its aura of comfort, leisure, utility to the decorum of a tailored suit, which, you know, might look a bit stiff, a bit too formal depending on the situation. I think that lays my intentions somewhat bare as well. Corduroy doesn't like to be pressed, and I'll come back to that later, but overall I did press it before cutting and I'm definitely going to press it a few times during this sewing session. When you stroke it along those ridges, because of those short hairs, you can see and feel how it's smooth in one direction and coarse and darker to the other. It also reflects light differently, which means that if you're stranded somewhere and completely bored, you can create art on your skirt like I've seen some people do on the internet. But you need to pay attention that all of your pattern pieces are following the same direction when you cut them out. On my back piece I added 1 cm seam allowance to the top and the side. The zipper is going to be at center back. I didn't add seam allowance here because I'm going to place the pattern piece directly next to the selvage of the fabric so that I won't have to finish this edge. I cut it out twice with my rotary cutter as usual. I cut little markings at the hip height where my hem is going to be and all those openings for the darts. To find the length of my darts, I pierce small holes into the paper and I mark them with chalk. The end of the zipper is going to be 1 centimeter lower than the hip line, which is essentially the widest line, and I mark it with chalk on the fabric as well. The selvage is 1 centimeter wide if you don't count this fluff here, same as the band of my zipper. Now I'm going to use an invisible zipper, which is a more elegant solution for garments in general, I find. In comparison to a regular zipper like this one, the whole zipping mechanism is curled back onto the other side, which makes the slider and the teeth almost float on top of the band. This will allow us to sew very closely to the teeth, thus making the zipper invisible. And when we curl it back on the other side here right next to the stitching, that's where we need to stitch as well, and it's 1 centimeter away from the edge of the band. There are several foot attachments that are meant to help with that. Tunnels like that are very popular. I personally find that a plain foot like this, a half foot essentially, works best, and I'm going to use two, I guess, mirrored version of these. Since I added 1 centimeter seam allowance to the top, I make sure that this lock here is 1 centimeter away from the edge. I start by transferring my marking onto the right side. The right side of the fabric is facing me, and I start with the left piece. The wrong side of the zipper is facing me. Now I open the zipper and I'm placing it so that the edge is right against the selvage, and so that the top starts directly at the top, obviously. And I stitch it on very slowly, taking breaks to adjust. With my left hand I make sure that the teeth are curled to the side so that the stitch is as close as possible. And with my right hand I constantly adjust the edges to each other, making sure that nothing gets pulled to the side. Once I reach my marking, I go back and forth a few times to close the stitch. Now I change the foot to its mirrored version, and I stitch the other side of the zipper in the same way to the right piece. Obviously, if it makes you feel a bit more secure, you can absolutely baste or pin your zipper beforehand, and make sure that you don't get into the teeth with your stitches accidentally. This is what it looks like on both sides. The end of the zipper stays loose. You can close it now. Double check that the height of both pieces is even. Now we need to close this bit of the seam, and that can be a bit tricky because ideally in a perfect world your seam needs to continue right here where the zipper opening ends. It is tricky to pinch your needle directly through there and so that it's even on both sides because the zipper is kind of in the way. I usually manage to start this seam about 2 millimeters close. I do it with the same foot, by the way, and then you just need to simply go straight down with the seam allowance in mind. There's this other method where you close the seam first and insert your zipper later. Well, I think it works for softer fabrics that you can easily press, that you can manipulate. Many tutorials don't show what this actual seam looks like inside, but just the finished zipper, which obviously looks great once your fabric is pressed into place. But when you have these very clear lines, like on this corduroy, for example, and with sturdier materials in general, there are more possibilities to make a mistake, because you have to be very precise when you insert your zipper so that there won't be a sort of bulge happening at the end of the zipper opening. And like I said, that can be concealed temporarily by pressing the fabric flat, but once you start wearing the garment, it can become quite obvious. So I really prefer to work in that order to ensure a very flat, continuous line. And that's the finished zipper, the finished center back. The front piece needs to be cut and fold, so while I'm folding my fabric, I triple check that the fold actually goes along the ridges, along those wales. With stripes, with ridges, with patterns, you obviously have to be extra careful because otherwise your garment is going to look crooked. I place the pattern next to the fold and I cut it out. I mark the center, top and bottom with a short snip, as well as the hip height, the hem and the openings for my darts. This will make sure that they are perfectly mirrored on both sides. To mark the end of the dart, I pierce a needle to the other side and mark it there as well. Darts are essentially there to sculpt a flat piece of fabric into a three-dimensional shape. So we have the openings of the dart marked here. These need to be placed onto each other, and we have the end that also dictates the direction of the fold. The dart needs to be stitched from here to there. A very common mistake I see when it's stitched in a very straight line, like a triangle basically. But to avoid pointiness at the end and to ensure a very smooth figure-hugging line, it needs to be sewn in a very concave curve. At the top I close my seam by going back and forth a few times, and it needs to go straight down for a bit. Remember also we have 1 centimeter seam allowance here. And then it needs to almost flare out towards the end, towards the edge. Don't close your seam with the machine to avoid bulkiness, to avoid pointiness, but let the threads loose and knot them at the end. Make sure that all the mirrored darts are symmetrical. If it helps you, there is no shame in using a curved ruler thingy. You can also baste your darts beforehand, although here I would advise to not use pins because those can disturb the lines very quickly. Now, like I said, corduroy doesn't like to be pressed because essentially what happens, all of these little hairs are going to be pressed flat and it gets this very distinct shine where you can clearly see the transfer of the layer that lies beneath it. So don't freak out if that happens. Don't worry about it too much while sewing, because this fluff can be brushed back into place, but still be as gentle as possible. Press on the wrong side. If that's not possible, press through a tissue, or better yet through a soft, slightly damp towel. But still, once you put it on, since it's a very tight garment, it'll press itself into position anyway. When pressing darts, it's best to do it over something rounded because we are creating a rounded shape. But since I'm working with a somewhat stretchy material, I very gently press them flat to the sides, and I always press my darts away from the center. Now I'm going to connect my front and back pieces. A very simple stitch. If I place my needle to the far left, the edge of my foot is exactly 1 centimeter away, which is my seam allowance, of course, and while sewing I make sure that the edges lie over each other and that the markings that I cut before at the hip height or at the hem meet on both pieces. I'm not going to line this skirt. I don't find it necessary, especially with short skirts, and I usually wear slip dresses underneath anyway, which means that all the edges are going to be bare to the eye. If you have an overlock machine, if you want to, go ahead and serge off these edges. It's a very quick affair. It'll make sure that they won't fray. Maybe because they are so often used in fast fashion, I just don't think they're pretty to look at. Maybe it's just me, they kind of make me sad. They just don't look finished to me. And especially since the skirt is going to be bare on the inside, I want to look at it when I put it on and see how pretty it is and blah 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 blah. Yeah, so when I was working on the slip dress, I messed up a few bias tape pieces. So, you know, might as well use those. If you are at the same level of insanity and want to make something similar, you can use ready-made bias tape here, or better even, you can cut strips of some lightweight fabric on bias that is roughly the same length as your side seams and about 2 centimeters wide. So I placed the right side of my bias tape onto the edge and stitched 5 millimeters next to it. Now I will sort of press and pull it to the other side over the corduroy and stitch again into this seam, making sure that it covers the raw edge. This will prevent fraying of the corduroy fabric, and the bias tape itself won't fray because it will be essentially hidden from contact, and also because it's cut on bias. I've seen this method done in couture garments, in tailoring, and I think it's a very beautiful finish. This is what it looks like on the right side and on the wrong side. I will now also add a bias tape to the hemline because it's going to be folded under. I stitch it onto the right side, and because it goes in a circle, I start with my stitch here a bit later, and so that once I reach it again, I can fold it over by folding it towards me like that, and the end is just stitched over it. Other than that, it's all the same basically. I think the waistband is such a personal preference. I bet you can assign zodiac signs to different waistbands. So many choices. You can make it end with the zipper, you can make it wide or narrow. Usually if there is a button overlapping action, it's done like on this example here. The way I learned it and my preferred way is for it to overlap equally on both sides with the button in the center. Especially with the button, I think it gives this very vintagey, tailored look. I highly recommend using this thing. You need to add a bit of reinforcement to the waistband anyway. And this fleece lining is made specifically for waistbands. The shiny side, that's where the adhesive is, which activates with heat. And it has these sort of cutouts so that you'd be able to fold it precisely, sharply. It just makes this whole process much easier. One side is always a little bit shorter and the longer one is going to be on the inside. Overall though, my waistband is going to be roughly 3 centimeters wide. These parts here are for the seam allowance. So I pressed it onto my fabric and I cut it out along the wails. And again I used the selvage as orientation just to make sure that it's not crooked. As for the length, it's going to be my waist measurement plus 2 centimeters of overlapping on each side plus 1 centimeter seam allowance on each side. So I'm going to mark some points here for orientation. The middle, that's going to be connected to center front. The seam allowance, the 2 centimeters overlapping, and also where the side seams are going to be. For that I measured this width on my pattern, minus the dart of course. And the shorter side, we're going to pin it onto the skirt. Fabrics, even very sturdy ones, tend to stretch or shrink a bit when you sew them together, when you press them. And so because the waistband is very firm and set, it is going to be the reference. So I pinned all those markings to the skirt, the center front, the side seams. I'm going to quickly baste it all together because I do not like to sew over needles here. This is a very important, very visible seam. This is also a great time to make sure that all your darts, all the seam allowances lie to the side they're supposed to. And now the stitching is going to go right along this edge here. It's exactly 1 centimeter, so same as the seam allowance on the top of the skirt. Now I'm going to close the edges of the waistband for the overlapping. To make this edge as pointy as possible, you can use something sharp like a needle or a ruler. I really like this vertical and horizontal line combinations. So now we're going to fold the other seam allowance into the opening here. And with the right side of my skirt facing me, I'm going to stitch into this seam here very carefully. This technique has a very poetic name in German, to stitch in the shadow of the seam, im Schatten der Naht nähen, because the seam is going to be hidden in the shadow of the other seam. And yeah, this is the front, this is the inside. I started the seam right at the edge of the zipper. And these bits for the overlapping, I'm just going to quickly secure them with a few hand stitches. I am absolutely in love with buttons that are covered in the same fabric as the initial garment. I think there's something very elegant about it, and yet it's subtle. The button itself doesn't really add any new texture or color. Maybe I'm a little bit crazy, but I find little details like that are very important to ensure the versatility of a garment that is not meant as a statement piece, so that it always stays uniform in itself, in its design, and blends very easily with something else without clashing because of buttons or any other decorations. So the buttonhole usually needs to be about 1 centimeter longer than the width of the button. If you have a newer sewing machine, 10 out of 10. I would recommend to use it with one of these high-tech foot attachments. I'm going to do it by hand because I want to get better at it, but also because I'm scared to stitch stuff like that on my sewing machine. The opening for my button starts right at the center, and to find the correct position for the button, I recommend to try it on and pin it on yourself. Corduroy pieces are best stored flat, completely flat, but realistically the best way to store corduroy garments is on a hanger without folding it over a hanger, and definitely not on the ones that press the fabric to protect the fluff for a long time. So what I like to do is to make little loops out of strong thread, and I secure the thread here at the stitching of the waistband at the side seam. A bit of hand stitching and it's finished. On the pattern we added 4 cm seam allowance to the hemline. It needs to be folded under. To secure it, I grab the skirt so that the inside is facing me. I hide my knot behind the seam allowance of the side seam, and I pull my needle through this seam of the edge here on the inside. I go about 5 mm next to it, and now I try to pick up just a few threads on the back of my fabric without piercing through it so that it won't be noticeable on the other side. And again, 5 mm next to it, I pick up the edge again. You have to work softly here, don't pull too hard on the thread. That will be noticeable on the right side. It is almost meant to stay flexible. I definitely thought about making some sort of color palette for this whole wardrobe endeavor, but I think it will come along naturally anyway. Red is a color I always gravitate to, especially darker shades. I just read this book on the history of color. It's actually a series, but red is obviously the color. In some languages, red can also mean beautiful or colorful, in Russian for example. But apart from it being a very desired, a very conspicuous color, it also came to offer a variety of shades very early on. In a practical sense, I mean, on walls, canvas, wood or parchment, the musica of reds was always more pregnant, more cadenced and more resonant than others. From very early on, there were simply more recipes for red shades. That doesn't mean that it was cheap or easy or widely available at all. In the textile domain, scarlet red was often obtained from kermes, which was extremely tedious, a very expensive dye stuff, but apparently it had already been used in prehistoric times. So there's just a long history of knowledge, of trial and error, that has certainly contributed to it becoming the color, apart from all the associative possibilities that can be evoked by it. But to better understand the symbolic perspectives of the color red, its different shades, this book puts a lot of emphasis on describing what it would have been perceived next to other colors. For instance, in the Middle Ages, red in combination with white, blue, green was extremely favorable, representing life, virtue, power, love, all the good things, while the combination of red and black was viewed particularly negative. In clothing it was considered ugly and a bad omen, because to medieval eyes this combination evoked burning coals, hellfire, the devil himself and sin, which also applies to red shades tending toward yellow in general, like red hair. They really didn't like red hair back then. I'd like to talk more about colors in future videos, but my skirt is finished. This is what it looks like on the inside. Because of the stretch, it's pretty comfortable. The annoying thing about corduroy, as you might have noticed, because sewing is a somewhat dusty affair, is that it attracts lint and dust, so you'd need to brush it now and then. Most stains can also be simply brushed away, so I wouldn't wash it too often. It can be washed though on a regular setting. When it comes out of the washing machine, I just simply shake it out and let it dry. I would not press it. Most likely it'll pull itself back in shape once you put it on anyway, but if you have to, obviously on the wrong side and very gently. As for storage, I advise to hang it inside out to not attract lint, to protect the fluff once again. I'm definitely going to make more skirts in the future. I think I might make a long circle skirt next.